I don't really like rules. I would prefer to have more flexibility than have rules. So on this section, string crossing rules, maybe string crossing guidelines. So I feel like anytime I make a rule, immediately there comes up a situation where we have to break that rule. And that's true of absolute statements also, which that was just an absolute statement. Anyway, rules, guidelines, whatever, there are some things that we can pass on to our students that are repeatable, that they need to be able to do, and you shouldn't have to explain these things every single time we play a new piece of music. And this is going to vary by grade level, by music level, technique level, but they hold fast pretty true for, especially for sight reading. So the first, I guess, rule that I put into place with my younger students when it comes to string crossing is that we never cross strings just to play an open string. So this typically applies for the violin and viola. So if we have a tetrachord like E, F sharp, G, A, and then we have to go back down to G for the next note, like G, F sharp, E, like an E minor passage, we wouldn't want to go E, F sharp, G, cross to the A string, and then cross back for the G, because that breaks the rule of never cross strings just to play an open string. So then, they get into high school and you start playing Baroque music and, they say, oh, well, what about Bach? Yeah, that kind of breaks our rule, doesn't it? But look, we can argue about these nuances, or we could just have this rule established so that if we're sight reading a piece and, it's not a Baroque piece and we're trying to get through the thing, we have some structure in place for what should be happening and what shouldn't be happening in regard to string crossing. And I would say that not just string crossing, but the standardization of fingerings as well. And as the students become more advanced and as they start playing in different positions, then we can start having them discover different patterns and look at different tetrachords and be able to identify these patterns in the music that makes playing the music easier, and that will inherently reduce the number of string crossings that they have. Again, not for Baroque music, especially if you're trying to play an historically accurate performance. If you're playing in a period ensemble, you would never do it that way. But for general pieces of music outside of that era, which encompasses millions of pieces of music. So if I'm wrong about this, I would like to see a counterexample in the comments, actually. But I haven't found like an introduction to positions that does not start with third position and then go to fifth position. Like the odd numbered positions are favored well before the even numbered positions. However, in the literature, there's many places where second position, fourth position work out much better when you start seeing the patterns, with like Brahms, for instance, or Beethoven, Bach. Pretty much any composer that starts with a B, you should use even numbered positions. And if you took like a grade 1, maybe even some grade 2 string orchestra pieces and you gave them to an advanced high school group, they would probably play most of them in fourth position. And hopefully it's because they're starting to see these tetrachordal patterns. They're starting to see these 4-note patterns, and they recognize them and they start forming their fingerings around these patterns instead of bouncing around from string to string. I mean, usually not literally bouncing around, usually just crossing around from string to string. So yeah, you go through all these books and you have all these melodies and exercises that are written in third position. You learn how to play Mary Had a Little Lamb in third position, and you learn all the odd number positions. That's great. But then when you're playing concert music with your ensembles, can they transfer that skill into their concert music and say, oh, I remember that pattern from the technique book that I was working in, I'm going to use it here. And that may or may not be the case, because a lot of times in the sequence of learning, we're teaching these shifting sequences and these finger patterns, which are techniques that are above the concert music that you tend to work on in class, because they have to have the technique first before you start programming music. So sequentially, it may not work out that way. So in that case, or in the case where there is a finger pattern that uses an even numbered position, I think it's important to show the students where those are, or even bracket those passages in the students' parts so that they can start to figure out how to see these patterns in the wild. So I guess, the first rule, don't cross strings and just to play an open string. And the next one is, the next string crossing rule is to ask, do you have to cross strings in the first place? So you can get your students to start thinking about different positions and thinking, should I really cross strings here, or should I shift instead? So speaking of bouncing around from string to string, what if you are going from string to string and you're playing off the string? Maybe we should have a rule to encompass that technique too. And the rule is that when we bounce, we want to tilt the bow towards the string that we are going to cross to. So again, in the sequence and scope of learning, this is going to happen after the students start learning off the string techniques. And so this is going to happen probably after shifting and probably after open strings and that kind of thing. So spiccato, for instance, and you can watch the episode on spiccato, and in that episode we address, staying on the same string and how to sequence that. But what if you are going from string to string? That complicates things a bit, right? So when you're playing spiccato, let's say you're crossing to a lower string, you want to tilt that bow down, tilt the tip down, or this way, tilt the tip this way, so that the rebound will take you to the next string. And then crossing to a higher string, you want to tilt towards that higher string so that the rebound will take you to the next string up. Now, again, this isn't going to be absolute, because sometimes it's going to be a quicker passage and you can't afford to have a bigger rebound, or else the timing is going to be off going from string to string. And so it's not absolute. Again, you're going to have to break this rule from time to time. And I'll go into this in more detail in the episode on rhythm. So the next rule is to prepare the left hand for the string crossing so that the left hand is ready to go before the right hand crosses strings. And in your scope and sequence, this is going to happen around the same time that you're teaching double stops, more or less. And actually a good way to practice that is to practice double stops first, so that they're getting their fingers and they're getting them in tune and they're getting that good left hand shape so that they can facilitate that technique easier. So if you're using a finger pattern where you have your first finger on the D string and then you have your third finger on the A string, well, there's no reason why you can't have both of those fingers down at the same time, so that it's going to give you better coordination and better accuracy with what's coming up. And again, just like the patterns, the more you show your students this, the more they're going to see it in the music, and they're going to be able to anticipate what's coming up and be able to adjust their technique for this. So point it out in class and say, okay, you got this note here and you got this note here. Prepare the left hand, prepare the fingers, and the more you show them, the more they're going to start doing it on their own, so that you don't have to tell them. And this isn't going to take place overnight. You're not going to make these changes where you tell it to them once and then expect that the very next day they're using this technique fluidly and independently. No, you're going to have to continue to point it out to them again and again. And then, some of the brighter students are going to start figuring out this kind of stuff before maybe the rest of the class, and then everybody else kind of catches up and it all sort of evens out at the end. But, you still have to remind them, hey, and for that one kid in the back who should probably be up at the front so you can keep an eye on them, you're going to have to explain to that student so that you don't have students kind of slipping through the cracks. And eventually they get it too. So yes, there are exceptions to the rules, but it's good to have foundation and it's good to have structure. And if you have to deviate from that structure, okay, fine. But it's good to have a foundation in place. And I hope these rules cover the foundation for most of the music that you're playing in class, unless you're playing in a period ensemble or something like that. But, if you're in charge of a period ensemble, I doubt you're really giving fingerings out, So I don't think you're probably watching these videos. But if you're teaching middle school orchestra, high school orchestra, this might come in handy, and you might want to establish this with your students and, give them the structure. And then when you do play some Baroque music, you have to switch techniques and get them to think a little bit differently about it. But when you play Baroque music, you got to think about a lot of things differently, to be honest. And so to shift modes, mentally, that's going to take some work from a lot of different areas. So, it's going to be fun. But that shifting of style, whether it's from Baroque music or fiddle music, pops, whatever, it's so good for the students to play different types of music, to get them to expand their mind and play with different sorts of techniques. It's just really good for cognitive development, and it's really good for the students.